The lawyer was already waiting when she got back. Naomi Hayes had $11 in her checking account, a final notice from the bursar folded into a damp square in her coat pocket, and a body that hadn't felt warm since October. She had just come off an 8-hour overnight shift, her third that week, and she was running the math in her head the way she always did, the math that never came out right no matter how many times she ran it. When she rounded the corner into the lobby of Halloran Hall and saw the man in the gray suit standing by the front desk with a briefcase in one hand and in the other something that did not belong in a college dormitory at all. A metal ammunition box, dented, rusted at the corners, latched shut with a loop of twisted wire. She did not yet know what was inside it. She did not yet know that an old man she had met 3 weeks earlier, an old man she had bought a bus ticket for, a stranger she had fed and sat beside in the cold blue light of a bus terminal at 4 in the morning, had spent the last days of his life making sure that box reached her hands and no one else's. She did not know any of it, but she would. This is the story of how she found out. To understand what Naomi did at that bus station, you have to understand what kind of person makes a choice like that. And to understand that, you have to understand the kind of life that builds a person like her. She was 20 years old, and she had never in her life had the luxury of being careless with money. Her father had died overseas when she was 8 months old. She had no memory of him, not his voice, not his hands, not the weight of being held by him, only the artifacts that survived him. A folded flag in a triangular wooden case that sat on the mantel in her mother's apartment. A single greeting card, the only one he'd ever mailed home, kept behind glass because the ink had started to fade, and her mother could not bear to lose the handwriting. A name, David Hayes, that her mother spoke the way some people speak the names of saints, quietly, and only when it mattered. Her mother, Renee, had raised her alone in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat, working doubles at a diner and then later at a nursing home, her feet swelling so badly by the end of each shift that she'd sit in the bath with them propped on the edge of the tub, too tired to cry. There had been a survivor's benefit, supposedly, a death gratuity, a monthly payment for the family of a soldier killed in service, but the paperwork had vanished somewhere in the machinery of war and grief, and a young widow who didn't know which forms to file or which office to call. By the time anyone might have helped her untangle it, the trail had gone cold, the files had been boxed and shelved and forgotten, and Renee had simply stopped expecting the world to make good on anything. So she'd made do. They'd made do. Naomi grew up understanding the price of everything. She knew which gas stations sold day-old bread at a discount after 9 p.m. She knew how to make a pot of beans stretch across 4 dinners. She knew that when her mother said, "I already ate, baby, you have it," her mother had not, in fact, already eaten. She'd learned to lie back, "I'm not that hungry tonight either," so they could split the last of it and both pretend. And she had decided, somewhere around the age of 12, sitting on the fire escape doing homework by the orange glow of a streetlight, because the apartment's overhead bulb had burned out and they were waiting until payday to replace it, that she was going to be the one who broke the pattern. She was going to college. She was going to be the first. It nearly didn't happen. It still might not. She'd gotten in, a state school 2 hours from home, a partial scholarship, a stack of loans, and a gap. There was always a gap. The scholarship covered tuition but not housing. The loans covered housing but not books, not fees, not the 1,000 small bleeds that nobody tells a first-generation kid about until the bills arrive. So she worked. She worked the overnight shift at a gas-and-go off the interstate, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 and sometimes 5 nights a week, ringing up cigarettes and energy drinks and lottery tickets for truckers and insomniacs, and the occasional drunk who mistook the store's fluorescent glow for a reason to talk to someone for 40 minutes. She slept in fragments. She studied behind the register. She kept a textbook open next to the scratch-off display and read organic chemistry between customers. And when a professor once asked her, not unkindly, why she always looked so tired, she'd smiled and said she was a night owl. Because the truth? I work all night so I can sit in your class all day, and I send half of what's left home to my mother. Was not a thing you said out loud in a lecture hall full of kids whose biggest problem was a hangover. She sent money home, every month without fail. Not because her mother asked. Renee would have died before asking. But because Naomi remembered the bath, and the swollen feet, and the lie about already eating, and she had promised herself she would not let her mother carry it alone forever. She kept the money in a tin box under her dorm bed, cash mostly, because she didn't trust herself not to spend it if it lived in a bank where a card could reach it. Bill by bill, week by week, she filled it. It was meant for the holidays. It was meant to buy her mother one season of not counting. By that October, the box held a little over $300. And then the letter came. It was from the bursar's office, and it was, in the polite institutional language of people who have never once been broke, an eviction notice. Her account was past due. A combination of a financial aid disbursement that had come up short and a fee she hadn't known existed had left her owing a sum she could not produce, and if she did not produce it by the end of the month, she would be administratively withdrawn from her courses. Dropped. Unenrolled. 2 years of overnight shifts and behind-the-register chemistry erased. Because of a number. She did the math. She did it standing at the register at 3 in the morning with the letter spread flat on the counter and the cooler humming behind her, and a single moth beating itself against the inside of the window. She did it again. And again. The tin box under her bed, plus everything in her checking account, plus the next paycheck. It still wasn't enough. It wasn't close. She was going to lose it. All of it. Over a gap she hadn't created and couldn't close. That was the weight she was carrying the morning she met Walter. Her shift ended at 7. The bus that ran near campus didn't connect directly to the dorms. She had to transfer downtown at the central terminal, a great, drafty, concrete barn of a place that smelled of diesel and disinfectant, and the particular sourness of a building where too many people have waited too long for somewhere to go. She didn't usually linger there, but that morning her connecting bus was delayed, 20 minutes, then 30, and she sat on one of the cold steel benches with her backpack in her lap and the letter still in her pocket, too exhausted to read, too anxious to sleep, and she watched the terminal wake up around her. That was when she noticed the old man. He was sitting 3 benches down, and he had clearly been there a while. He wore a field jacket, olive drab, faded nearly to gray, the kind of jacket that had been issued to someone a long time ago and worn ever since, layered over 2 other shirts against the cold. His hands shook. Not from the temperature, she thought, though it was hard to be sure. There was a tremor in them that ran deeper than cold, a fine, constant trembling, and his eyes had the unfocused, glassy quality of a man who was not entirely in the room with the rest of them. He'd drift. He'd come back. He'd drift again, his lips moving slightly, as if he were carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. She might not have done anything. People learned, in places like that terminal, to keep their eyes to themselves. Everyone there was carrying something. You couldn't fix it. You couldn't even look at all of it. But then the ticket agent started in on him, and Naomi found that she could not keep her eyes to herself after all. Sir, you don't have enough."
You understand what I'm telling you? You're short. I can't sell you a ticket you can't pay for."
The old man had shuffled up to the window with a fistful of coins and crumpled bills, and he was trying to count it out onto the counter with fingers that would not cooperate. A nickel rolled off and spun on the linoleum. He bent for it slowly, painfully, and the line behind him shifted and sighed.
"There's people waiting," the agent said. "Come on, you need to step aside."
"I have to get home," the old man said. His voice was rough, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. I'm trying to get home."
"Then come back when you've got the fare."
The agent was not cruel, exactly. He was just tired and busy, and the old man was a problem with no solution that fit inside the agent's morning.
"Next."
"Sir, you're holding up the line. Next, please." The old man stood there a moment longer, looking down at the little pile of coins as if he might be able to add to it by force of will. Then his shoulders came down, and something in his face folded, and he turned and shuffled back toward the bench, muttering. And the muttering had a shape to it that Naomi would only understand much later. "Home," he was saying. "Supposed to go home. Made a promise. Have to keep the..." Naomi knew exactly what it felt like to be counted and found short. She stood up. She didn't decide to, not in the way you decide things. She was simply on her feet and walking to the window before she had finished arguing herself out of it. Because the part of her that did the arguing, the part that knew what was in the tin box under her bed and what she needed it for, was outvoted by the older, deeper part of her that had grown up in a 2-room apartment learning that you do not let people go hungry or cold if you have anything at all to give. "How much is his ticket?" she said to the agent. The agent blinked at her. "Ma'am? His ticket. Wherever he's trying to go, how much is the difference?" She had counted out her own bus fare that morning to the exact dollar, the way she counted everything. She did not have the difference, not loose in her wallet. What she had, and she knew it the way you know a thing you've decided in your bones before your mind catches up, was the tin box money. She had pulled $40 from it that week to cover a textbook rental and hadn't yet put it back. It was in the inner pocket of her backpack, folded small. 4 $10 bills, almost all the spending money she had in the world. She paid the difference. And then, because the old man had not eaten, she could see it in him, the particular hollowness of it. She had grown up around that hollowness. She could spot it across a room. She paid for a hot breakfast from the terminal's grim little food counter, too. A sausage biscuit, a coffee, a carton of orange juice. $8 more she would never see again. "You don't have to do that," the old man said when she set the food down beside him on the bench. His eyes had come into focus, slowly, like fog burning off. He looked at her, really looked, and there was something almost frightened in it, a man so unused to being seen that being seen alarmed him. "I know," Naomi said. She sat down next to him. "But I want to." He ate slowly, carefully, one small bite at a time, as if the food might disappear if he took it for granted, as if he had learned somewhere along the way not to trust that a meal in front of him was really his to finish. Naomi sat beside him and did not pepper him with questions. She'd grown up understanding something that a lot of well-meaning people never learn, that the kindest thing you can offer a person who is suffering is not interrogation, but company. Not "what happened to you" and "how did you end up here" and "don't you have family?" The questions that make a person account for their own ruin, but simply the fact of another human being willing to sit on the cold bench beside them and not leave. So she sat, and after a while, in pieces, he talked. His name was Walter. He had been a soldier,
a long time ago, he said. And then he stopped, and a silence opened up behind those 4 words so vast that he seemed not to know where in it to begin. So he didn't.
He was trying to get home, he said again. Though when she gently asked where home was, his answer wandered, and the name of the town he gave her was one she'd later learn had not had a bus stop in 30 years. Home, for Walter, was not a place at the end of a bus line. It was something else. Somewhere else. Somewhen else, maybe. His bus came before she could learn much more. The PA crackled the route number, the doors of the gate hissed open. And then Walter did something that stayed with her. He grabbed her wrist, not hard, but with a sudden, surprising urgency, and for a moment the fog cleared entirely from his eyes, and there was someone sharp and proud and lucid looking out of them. "I don't take charity," he said. The roughness in his voice had gone flat and hard, like a man stating a fact he had built his whole self around. "Not once it's a habit. You hear me? I'll take a hand once when a man's down, but I have never in my life taken the same hand twice without paying it back. Not once." And he reached up and unbuckled the watch from his wrist. It was an old military watch, the case scratched dull, the crystal clouded and crazed with a spiderweb of fine cracks, the leather band worn so thin at the buckle that it was a wonder it held at all. He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers over it with both of his shaking hands. "Collateral," he said. "I'll pay you back. I keep my word, miss. I might be slow. God knows I've been slow." Something crossed his face when he said that. A grief, a guilt, a shadow she couldn't read. "But I have never broken a promise in my life. Not one. You hold on to that till I make us square." "Sir, I don't need—" "You hold on to it." His grip tightened. "Promise me you'll keep it safe." And because it seemed to matter to him more than anything in that drafty terminal could possibly matter, she said, "Okay, I'll keep it safe. I promise." He nodded, satisfied, as if a contract had been signed and witnessed. Then he gathered the remains of his breakfast, tucked the orange juice carton into a jacket pocket for later, and shuffled toward the gate. At the door he turned and looked back at her one more time. And she would spend a long time afterward trying to remember the exact expression on his face. Something searching. Something almost like recognition. Something he couldn't quite name, and neither could she. Then the doors closed and the bus pulled out, and Naomi sat alone on the cold bench with a stranger's broken watch in her hand, and 48 fewer dollars than she'd had an hour before. And she thought, with the flat exhaustion of someone who has just made their own bad situation worse out of a kindness they couldn't afford, "Well, that's that. I'll never see him again." She slipped the watch into the inner pocket of her backpack, next to where the money had been, and she did not look at it closely. If she'd turned it over right then and read what was engraved on the back, the next 3 weeks of her life would have unfolded very differently. But she didn't. She was too tired. She caught her bus. She went back to the dorm and slept 4 hours, and got up and went to class and then went to work, and the night swallowed her again, and the watch lay forgotten in the dark of her backpack, ticking, running a few seconds slow, the way it always had. She was sure she'd never see him again. She was wrong. 3 nights later he came back. She was on shift, the dead middle of it, 2:40 in the morning, the store empty, the parking lot a black sheet under the buzzing lights, when she looked up from her chemistry textbook and saw a figure outside under the sign.
The gas and go sign had been broken for as long as she'd worked there.
The big illuminated panel on the pole by the road flickered. Gas NG_O. The second O guttering on and off like a dying nerve. And it had been flickering for the better part of a year. Management knew. Corporate knew. Everyone had stopped seeing it. It was just one more broken thing in a world full of broken things that nobody was coming to fix. And there, beneath it, stood Walter. He had dragged over an empty milk crate to stand on, and he had the access panel at the base of the pole open, and he was doing something to the wiring with a screwdriver he'd produced from somewhere, his shaking hands somehow steady at this one task. And as she watched through the glass, the sign flickered, and then steadied, held, burned clean and whole and bright for the first time in a year. Gas N go. She went out into the cold. Walter? He looked up from the milk crate, blinked at her, and for a moment she saw the fog roll across his eyes again before it cleared. Loose connector, he said, as though that explained everything. His presence, the hour, the fact that he was supposedly 200 miles away on a bus to a town that no longer existed. Corroded. They never seal these things right. I cleaned it up. You should get another few years out of it now.
How did you get here? Your bus?
I fix things, he said simply. He climbed down off the crate with the careful, jointed slowness of an old body. Always could. In the unit, when something broke, mine was the name they called. Cole'll fix it, they'd say. Get Cole. He said it with a flicker of pride that lit him up briefly, like the sign. Never could stand a thing that didn't work when it ought to. He had not gone home. Wherever the bus had taken him, he had found his way back, and Naomi understood. Not in words, not yet, but somewhere underneath words, that for Walter, there was no home at the end of any bus line. There was only the road, and the cold, and the long, unfinished business of a promise he had not yet found a way to keep. She didn't have it in her to send him off into the dark. She made him a coffee from the store's machine. Black, on the house. Don't argue with me. It's free. I'll throw it out otherwise. And he sat on the curb outside the door and drank it. And she stood in the doorway between the warmth and the cold, and they talked a little. And that became the pattern. He started coming around, not every night, but often. He'd appear out of the dark with his screwdriver and his quiet competence, and he'd fix things. The stuck nozzle on pump 4 that the regulars had complained about for months, the door of the cooler that wouldn't seal, a flickering tube in the ceiling lights. He never asked to be paid. He'd have refused if she'd offered. He was, she came to understand, working off the debt, the ticket, the breakfast, the $48, in the only currency he had left, which was the work of his hands. And she understood that to refuse it, to tell him it wasn't necessary, would have been to take from him the one thing he had managed to keep through everything, his refusal to be a man who took without giving back. So she let him fix things. And she kept a coffee waiting for him each night, black, and she set out a sandwich from the cooler that she rang up on her own account and ate the cost of, and told him it was about to expire and she'd only have to throw it away, which was sometimes even true. He kept a photograph in the breast pocket of his field jacket. He took it out sometimes when he sat on the curb and held it in both hands and looked at it the way her mother looked at the faded greeting card behind glass. Once, he let her see it. It was a black and white photo, old, soft at the creases from 1,000 foldings and unfoldings. A squad of young soldiers, a dozen of them, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera and at a future that, she would think later, most of them had probably never lived to see. Boys. They were boys in the picture. Walter was in there somewhere, he said,
and pointed with a trembling finger at a young man in the back row, lean and laughing, and she could not find the old man in the young one's face. And then, all at once, she could, around the eyes, and it broke something in her a little to see it. "Good men," Walter said softly, his finger moving over the faces. "Every one. We were going to come home together. That was the deal, you understand. You come home together. You don't leave anybody." His finger stopped on one of the faces, a young man near the center, half-turned, mid-laugh. Walter's hand began to tremble harder, and his jaw worked, and he did not say the name. And after a moment he folded the photograph along its soft, worn creases and put it back in his pocket, and looked out at the dark parking lot for a long time without speaking. Naomi did not push him. She was good at not pushing. She had no idea then whose face his finger had stopped on. The strangeness started small, and then it stopped being small. The first time, it was her name. He was sitting on the curb with his coffee, and she crouched down beside him to hand him a sandwich, and the light from the doorway fell across the name tag pinned to her work vest, the cheap engraved plastic rectangle every employee wore, and Walter went still. Naomi Hayes. He read it. She watched him read it, and the color drained out of his weathered face the way water drains out of a cracked basin, all at once and completely. And the coffee in his hands began to shake so badly that it slopped over the rim and burned his fingers, and he didn't even seem to feel it. "Hayes," he said. It came out of him barely above a whisper. "That's me." She tried to make it light. "Naomi Hayes, at your service. World's most overqualified gas station clerk." He didn't laugh. He kept staring at the name tag, his lips moving, and she had the strangest sense that he was reading not her name but someone else's, somewhere behind hers, a name buried so deep and so long that the sound of it surfacing frightened him. "You're—" He stopped, swallowed. "That's your family name? Hayes?" "My dad's," she said. "Yeah." Walter turned his face away from her toward the dark and would not look at her again that night. And when his next silence stretched past the point where she could think of anything to fill it with, she went back inside and let him be. The second time, it was the coffee. She'd made it the way she always made his, black, no sugar. She'd offered sugar early on and he'd waved it off. And one night, he took the cup from her and looked down into it and laughed. A small laugh, but it caught in his throat halfway and came out almost like a sob. "Knew a fellow once," he said. "Took his coffee black. But then he'd dump in so much sugar you could stand a spoon up in it. Whole squad gave him hell for it. Said he wasn't drinking coffee, he was drinking syrup. Said his teeth were going to fall out before the enemy ever got the chance." He shook his head, smiling at something only he could see. "Sweetest tooth in the United States Army, that boy. Sweetest tooth, and His voice thickened. "And the biggest heart I ever—" He stopped. And Naomi, crouched there on the cold curb, felt the hair stand up on her arms, because her mother had told her, more than once, in the soft voice she used for the few stories she had, that David Hayes took his coffee black and then ruined it with so much sugar it was a family joke, that on their first date he'd done it, and Renee had thought, "This man is going to be trouble," and married him anyway. She didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. The coincidence sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't quite swallow or spit out, and she told herself it was a coincidence, because what else could it be? And she watched Walter drink his coffee and look out at the dark, and she felt the ground shift very slightly under her feet, without understanding why. The third time, it was the words.
He was tired that night, more confused than usual, the fog thicker behind his eyes. And as he worked at some small, broken thing under the lights, he muttered to himself, and the muttering resolved, as she came closer, into something with a shape, a cadence, a creed, the worn, smooth syllables of something said so many times it had stopped being words and become a kind of prayer. No one left behind. One man is all of us. All of us is one man. He said it the way you say a thing you have said 10,000 times. He said it the way you say a thing you have failed at. And the fourth time, the last time, the night before the last night, he reached out and took her hand, and his eyes, which had been wandering and clouded all evening, suddenly cleared completely, and what looked out of them was lucid and terrified, a man surfacing from deep water with one breath left in him. "Your father," Walter said, gripping her hand. "Did he get the letter? Tell me he got the letter." "I sent it." "I swear I sent it. Did he read it? Does he know that I—"
"Walter." She kept her voice very gentle, the way you'd speak to someone standing at a height. "Walter, my dad died a long time ago when I was a baby. I never even knew him." "I know," Walter said. And the tears came then, sudden and silent, running down into the deep canyons of his face. "I know that, child. I was there." She went cold all the way through. "I was there," he said again, and his hand tightened on hers until it almost hurt, and then, in a voice gone small and broken as a child's, he said her father's name. Not your father, not the Hayes boy. He said it whole, first name and last, the full name, said it the way her mother said it, the way you say the name of someone you loved and lost. And it was a name Naomi had never once spoken to him, a name he could not have known, a name he should not have had.
And then Walter Cole put his face in his shaking hands and wept like a man who has carried something too heavy for too long and has finally been allowed to set it down. Naomi knelt on the cold concrete and held the old man while he cried. And she did not understand yet what she was holding, but she understood that it was the heaviest thing in the world. He died 3 days later. She found out the way you find out about the people who live at the edges of things, secondhand, late, almost by accident. A call to the gas station's landline, of all places. A nurse from the Veterans Hospital across town, her voice careful and kind in the way of people who deliver this news for a living. There had been an old man, brought in off the street, very sick, very confused, pneumonia, his heart, his lungs, a body finally giving out after years of being asked to survive what it had survived. He'd had no ID that meant anything, no next of kin on any record, nothing the hospital could use to find a single soul who might want to know. Except a notebook. A battered little spiral notebook in his jacket pocket, its pages soft and water-stained, full of a cramped, shaking hand. And on the last page, beneath everything else, where a man writes the thing he is most afraid of forgetting, the nurse had found a phone number. The gas station's number, copied from the receipt taped inside the door, and beneath it, 3 lines. The girl at the gas station, David's daughter. Keep the promise. That was how the nurse had known to call. That was the only thread he'd left, and he'd tied it at the very end to her.
Naomi did not cry at first. She thanked the nurse. She wrote down the few details she was given. She finished her shift because there was no one to cover it, and the store could not simply close, and she rang up cigarettes and lottery tickets and coffee for the 4 a.m.
Truckers, with her face perfectly composed. And it was only when the sky outside began to gray toward dawn, and the parking lot was empty, and the sign, his sign, the one he'd fixed, burned clean and steady against the lightening sky, that she let herself sit down on the cold curb where he used to sit, and take the watch out of her backpack, and finally, turn it over and look at the back. She had carried it for 3 weeks and never looked. There was an engraving on the case back, small, worn shallow by years against a wrist, but legible if you held it to the light. To Walter, who pulled me out of the fire, I owe you my life. D.H. D.H. She read it 4 times before she let herself understand it. D.H. The handwriting that engraver had copied, she would never be able to prove this, but she knew it in her body the moment she saw it, was the same slanting hand that lived behind glass on her mother's wall. The hand that had written the only card her father ever sent home. D.H. David Hayes. The watch had not been Walter's gift to her. It had been her father's gift to Walter decades ago, on the far side of a fire that one of them had walked out of, and one of them had not. And Walter had carried it every day all those years, on the wrist of the very hand that her father had reached into the flames to save. And then he had pressed it into the palm of David's daughter and called it collateral, and made her promise to keep it safe, because it was the most precious thing he owned and the only true thing he had left to give. That was when Naomi finally cried. She cried for the old man who fixed broken signs in the middle of the night. She cried for the father she'd never met, laughing in a black and white photograph, ruining his coffee with too much sugar. She cried for both of them, and for her mother in the bath with her swollen feet, and for the 8-month-old baby she'd been, held once by a man who knew, even then, that he might not be coming back. She cried until the sun came up over a gas station off the interstate, and the sign burned bright and whole above her, and somewhere a man who had spent his whole life keeping a promise was finally home. The lawyer came 9 days later. She had gone back in the meantime to the slow drowning of her own life, the bursar's deadline now 4 days off, the tin box under her bed counted and recounted, the impossible number that hadn't moved. She had decided, in the flat way you decide things when there's nothing left to decide, that she was going to lose her place at school. She'd started privately to make her peace with it. She'd go home. She'd work full-time. She'd try again in a year or 2, or never. People like her didn't get to assume there'd be a next time. But she'd try. And then she came back from her overnight shift, exhausted to the marrow, and there was a man in a gray suit standing in the lobby of Halloran Hall, with a briefcase in one hand and a dented, rust-cornered, wire-latched ammunition box in the other. "Ms. Hayes?" he said. "Naomi Hayes?" "Yes?" "My name is Arthur Glassman. I'm an attorney." He shifted the ammo box, which was clearly heavier than it looked. "I represented the estate of a Mr. Walter Cole. Before he passed, he engaged me to handle a number of matters and to deliver something to you. In person. He was extremely specific about that. Not by mail, not through a third party. Into your hands and no one else's." A faint, tired smile. "It took him most of 2 months in that hospital to get all the paperwork signed. He was a very determined man. Toward the end, he could barely hold a pen, but he wouldn't stop until it was done." He held out the ammunition box. Naomi's hands were not quite steady as she took it. She brought him up to the common room on her floor. It was empty at that hour, the gray morning light coming in through the windows, the radiator clanking. And she sat down at the scarred wooden table and untwisted the wire from the latch and opened the box. On top was a letter. The paper was old, yellowed, soft, folded and refolded so many times that it had gone furred at the creases and nearly split along them. The ink had faded to a pale brown, and the handwriting, she didn't even have to think about it. She knew it the way you know a face. It was the handwriting from behind the glass on her mother's wall. The slanting, careful, slightly boyish hand of David Hayes. Her father had written this, not Walter, her father. Across more than 20 years, across a war and a death, and a span of time longer than she had been alive, her father was about to speak to her. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. To my daughter, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. And it means you've grown up bigger than the little thing I'm holding in my arms as I write this, the night before we move out. You're asleep on your mother's chest in a picture I'm keeping in my pocket. And you have no idea I'm going anywhere. And you have no idea your old man is sitting up writing you a letter you might never need to read. God, I hope you never need to read it. I don't know who you'll be. I don't get to know. That's the part that's hard to sit with. Not the going, but the not knowing who you'll be. Whether you'll be funny, whether you'll be stubborn like your mother, you will be. What your voice will sound like. I'd give anything, baby. Anything. But here's the one thing I do know, and I want you to hold on to it. If I'm gone, I left you in the best hands I ever found. There's a man in my unit named Walter Cole. He's older than the rest of us, been in longer, knows everything, fixes everything, gives everybody hell, and would die for any one of us without a second thought. He's the finest man I know, and he's promised me, we promised each other the way you do out here, that if anything happens to one of us, the other one looks after what's left behind. He gave me his word. And Naomi, I have never in my life met a man who keeps his word like Walter Cole. He'll come. Maybe not right away. Life is hard and men get lost. But he'll come, and he'll make it right, because that's who he is. So be good, sweetheart. Be kind. Kinder than the world is to you, which I'm afraid is the only way that matters. Take care of your mother, and know that you were loved more than you can hold by a man you won't remember. I have to go. They're calling it. Love, your father. Naomi read it 3 times. The lawyer waited, looking out the window, giving her the room. When she could speak again, she said, "How did Walter get this? My father wrote this. This was my father's. How did he—" "He kept it," Arthur Glassman said quietly. "For all those years, he told me. I'll tell you what he told me because he wanted you to know and because I don't think I have the right to keep any of it from you now." And he told her the rest. This is what Walter Cole had told the lawyer in the long, slow afternoons of a hospital room while a recording device ran and a pen got harder and harder to hold. There had been a fire. A vehicle hit, burning, men trapped inside. Walter had been one of them, pinned, dazed, the cabin filling with smoke and heat, the certainty of it settling over him the way it does. This is it. This is the place. This is where it ends. And then a hand had come through the smoke. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, who should have stayed under cover, who had every reason and every order to stay back.
and who instead had come into the fire and gotten a grip on Walter's harness and pulled him out, pulled him clear, pulled him back into a world he had already finished saying goodbye to. David Hayes. He'd pulled Walter out, and then he'd gone back, because there was one more man. There was always, with David, one more man. No one left behind. And the second time, the fire did not let him go. David Hayes died saving the men in that vehicle, one of whom was Walter Cole, who lived because a man half his age had decided in a fraction of a second that Walter's life was worth more than his own. A few weeks before that day, David had given Walter the watch, a small thing, a joke almost. "Here, old man, so you'll know when it's chow time without asking me." Engraved on the back as a gag, "Who pulled me out of the fire?" Because Walter had once dragged David out of a different scrape, a minor one, and they'd laughed about it. And then the joke became a prophecy in reverse, and the man who'd had the words engraved was the one who walked into the fire, and Walter was left holding a watch that said, "I owe you my life," on the wrist of a man who now owed his. He brought David's body home. He folded the flag. He stood at the funeral. Renee remembered a soldier there, she'd told Naomi once, an older man who stood at the back and left before she could speak to him. And Naomi understood now, sitting in the gray morning light, that the soldier at the back had been Walter, and he had every intention, in that first raw season of grief, of stepping forward, of finding the widow and the baby and making good on the promise.
If anything happens to one of us, the other looks after what's left behind. He'd given his word. He meant to keep it. But the war Walter brought home did not stay overseas. It came back inside him. The smoke and the fire, and the boy's hand, and the going back the second time, replayed behind his eyes every night for years. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't hold a job. Couldn't be in a room full of people. Couldn't bear a loud sound. Couldn't get through a day without the past breaking over him like a wave and dragging him under. He drank for a while to make it stop, and it didn't stop. It only took the rest of what he had. He lost his work. He lost his apartment. He lost the thread of his own life and could not find it again. And the shame was the worst of it. Worse than the cold or the hunger or the nights under bridges. Because how do you walk up to a widow's door? How do you knock and say, "Hello, ma'am, you don't know me. I'm the man your husband died saving. He went back into the fire for me, and I lived. And look what I did with the life he bought me." How do you let a grieving woman and a fatherless child see that? He couldn't. Year after year, he couldn't. The longer he failed to come, the more impossible coming became, because now there was the failure itself to explain on top of everything else. The decades of absence, the broken promise stacking up behind him like a debt that compounded daily. He told himself he'd go when he was better, when he had something to show, when he could face them as a man and not a ruin. And better never came, and the years ran on, and the boy in the photograph stayed young and laughing and dead, while Walter grew old and lost and alive. But he never spent it. That was the thing the lawyer wanted her to understand. Through all of it, the drinking, the hunger, the nights with nothing, Walter Cole had kept a separate thing set aside, untouchable, sacred. Whatever he earned at the odd jobs, the repairs, the work of his good hands, he kept a portion back, and he did not touch it. Ever. Not when he was starving, not when he was freezing. Because it wasn't his. It was theirs.
It was the promise, converted into the only form he could manage, saved a few dollars at a time across the wreckage of a life, for the wife and the child of the man who'd walked into the fire. He was always going to bring it to them. He just couldn't make himself bring it yet. And then, one cold morning at a bus station, a young woman who didn't have it to give had bought him a ticket and a hot breakfast and sat beside him in the cold without asking him to account for a single thing. And he'd seen the name on her vest. Hayes. He'd known. God, he'd known. Known the way you know the one thing you've spent your whole life both seeking and fleeing. David's daughter. Grown. Right in front of him.
Giving him the last of her own money, the way her father had given the last of his own life. He could have told her that night. He didn't. He was too afraid. Afraid she'd hate him for the decades of silence. Afraid he wasn't worthy to stand in front of David's child and say, "I'm the one your father died for." Afraid that the moment he'd spent a lifetime failing to face had finally arrived, and he would fail it one last time. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept coming back. He fixed her broken sign. He worked off his debt with his hands, the way he'd worked off every debt his whole life. And he stayed close. And he gave her his coffee shop stories and his old photograph and, finally, in the only way he could, the truth, leaking out of him in pieces, in the coffee and the words and the question about the letter, as his body failed and the fog rolled in and the careful walls he'd built for 40 years came down. He'd held on just long enough. That was the thing the lawyer kept coming back to, the thing that undid Naomi completely. Walter had been dying for weeks. Should have been in a hospital long before he was, and he had stayed on his feet, stayed out there in the cold, kept coming back to that gas station, because he had one last thing to do, and he was not going to die until it was done. He got the lawyer. He signed the papers with a hand that could barely close around a pen. He got it all in order. He kept the promise. And then, and only then, he let himself go home. "He told me to tell you something," Arthur Glassman said. "His exact words. He made me write them down so I'd get them right." He took out a small card and read from it. "Tell her I'm sorry I was so slow. Tell her her father was the bravest man I ever knew, and I spent my whole life trying to be worth what he did, and I never was, except maybe this once, at the end. Tell her the watch is hers now, free and clear. The debt's paid. We're square." There were two more things in the box, beneath the letter. The first was the money. It was wrapped in old envelopes, bundled and rubber-banded, soft from handling. Singles and fives and tens and 20s. The slow accretion of a life lived on almost nothing. Every bill of it set aside and not spent. On the envelopes, in Walter's cramped, shaking hand, he had written over and over, like a man reminding himself why he was going without. For David's family. For the girl, if I ever find her. For her schooling. David always said she'd go to school. She didn't count it then. She couldn't. But it was more than she had ever seen in one place in her life. And it was, she would learn, far more than enough. Enough for the bursar, enough for the deadline 4 days off, enough to make the impossible number not impossible after all. He had saved her place at school without ever knowing she was about to lose it, simply by keeping faith for 40 years with a man he'd loved. The second thing was a folder. Inside it was paperwork, official, stamped, organized, the kind of paperwork that does not assemble itself. It was the survivor's benefit, the death gratuity, and the monthly payments that should have come to Renee Hayes for 20 years and never had, lost in the machinery of a war and a young widow
who didn't know which door to knock on. Walter, in the last months of his life, sick and confused and barely able to hold a pen, had gone and dug it out. He had hauled himself into government offices and sat in plastic chairs and waited and been sent away and come back, and he had pulled the Hayes file out of whatever dusty shelf it had been sleeping on for 2 decades, and he had gotten it moving. He had spent the last of his strength making the world finally pay a debt it had owed a soldier's family since before that soldier's daughter could walk. The lawyer explained what it meant. Naomi understood about 1/3 of it, but the part she understood was this. Her mother in the bath with her swollen feet, her mother who said, "I already ate, baby." Her mother was going to be all right. The weight Renee had carried alone for 20 years was coming off. Not as charity, as what they were owed, as what a young man had earned with his life and an old man had spent his death making sure they finally received. Naomi sat at the scarred wooden table in the gray morning light with her father's letter in one hand and a dead stranger's life savings in the other, and she understood, fully and at last, what she had been part of. She had bought a ticket for a man she thought she would never see again, and the man had turned out to be the keeper of her whole history, the last living witness to the bravest thing her father ever did, the carrier of a promise older than she was, the one person on earth who had been quietly trying, against all his own ruin, to find his way back to her family for as long as she'd been alive. And on the one cold morning their paths finally crossed, she had reached out to him with the last of what she had, not knowing, never knowing, and in doing so, had given him the thing he needed to finally come home. The promise had run both ways. He had been looking for her for 40 years, and when at last they met, neither of them recognizing the other, she had still known to be kind. She called her mother that night. She had meant to wait until she had the words right, until she could lay it out clean and gentle. But there are some things you cannot hold inside you for even one more hour. And so she sat on the floor of her dorm room with her back against the bed and the ammunition box open beside her, and she called home. And when her mother answered, "Naomi, baby, it's late. Is everything all right?" she found she couldn't speak at all. "Naomi, what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong." "Nothing's wrong, Mama." Her voice came out wrecked. "Nothing's wrong. Something's right. I have to tell you something, and I need you to sit down." She told her, all of it. The bus station and the breakfast and the watch. The old man who fixed the broken sign, who took his coffee black, who kept a soft, creased photograph in his pocket. The name on her vest and the color leaving his face. The coffee with too much sugar. The question about the letter. The night he'd said David's name, the whole name, the name only the two of them in all the world still said that way, and wept on the cold curb. And the lawyer in the gray morning, and the box, and the letter in a hand they both knew by heart. She read her father's letter aloud over the phone, her voice breaking on every other line. And on the other end of the line, 200 miles away in the apartment above the laundromat, she heard her mother make a sound she had never heard her make in 20 years. A sound that wasn't quite weeping and wasn't quite a name. The sound of a grief that has been held so long and so carefully, finally being allowed to move. When Naomi finished, there was a long silence on the line, and then her mother said, in a voice gone very quiet and very far away, "There was a man at the funeral. Mama, I never told you, because I never knew who he was. An older soldier. He stood at the very back the whole time by himself.
He never came up to the family line. And when it was over, before I could get to him, I wanted to thank him. I wanted to know who he was. He was already gone. Walked off across the grass before anybody could stop him. Her mother's voice trembled. I thought about that man for years, Naomi. The one who couldn't even stay. I used to wonder what your father was to him, that he'd come all that way and not say a single word. A breath. It was him, wasn't it? It was him the whole time. It was him, Mama. He came to the funeral, her mother whispered. And he couldn't come up to us. For 20 years, he couldn't come up to us. And then, fierce and broken all at once. Oh, that poor, poor man. That poor, good man. If I had known, Naomi, if I had only known, I would have made him a place at our table. I would have set a plate. He didn't have to carry it alone. He didn't have to carry it alone all that time. I know, Mama. Your father loved him. It wasn't a question. You don't write a letter like that about a man you don't love. I know. They stayed on the line a long time after that, mostly not talking. Two women holding a dead man's promise between them across 200 miles of dark. And it was, Naomi would think later, the first conversation she and her mother had ever had as two people who had both, finally, been allowed to set something down. The tuition got paid. She was not withdrawn. She finished the semester, and the next, and the ones after that. Her mother stopped working doubles. The benefit came through, slowly, the way these things do, but it came. And there was a day, that winter, when Naomi called home and her mother told her, in a strange, wondering voice, that she had sat down that afternoon and done nothing. Just sat in the quiet, without the math running, and that she had not known, until it stopped, how loud the math had been all those years. Walter had no family that anyone could find, so Naomi and her mother buried him. They had him laid to rest with full honors, a folded flag, a bugle in the cold. And Renee stood at the graveside of the soldier who had stood at the back of her husband's funeral 20 years before, and the two of them, the widow and the daughter, were the family that saw him off, because they were the family he'd died trying to reach. On her desk in the dorm, Naomi keeps two photographs now, side by side. One is her father, David Hayes, young, in a black and white photo her mother finally let her have, laughing at something off camera, a paper cup of coffee in his hand that she knows now was ruined with too much sugar. The other is the squad photo, soft at the creases from 1,000 foldings, with a young Walter Cole grinning in the back row beside a young David Hayes, the two of them arm in arm, alive and whole, and certain they'd come home together, the way they'd promised. And on her wrist, every day, she wears an old military watch with a clouded crystal and a worn leather band. It runs a few seconds slow. She has never had it fixed. She likes that it's slow. It feels right. To Walter, who pulled me out of the fire, I owe you my life. It kept ticking the whole time he carried it. Through the fire and the funeral and the bridges and the cold and the 40 years of being lost, it never stopped, not once. The way he never stopped. The way the promise never stopped. Passing from a dying man's hand into the palm of the baby he'd held, carried across a span of years longer than her whole life, and laid down at last, intact, paid in full. Sometimes, late, when she's studying behind the register on the overnight shift, with the cooler humming and a moth at the window, and the sign he fixed burning clean and steady out by the road. Naomi looks up and thinks she understands the thing he spent his whole life trying to teach her, without ever saying it plainly. That kindness given to a stranger in the dark is never really given to a stranger. That the dead go on protecting the living in ways the living can't see. That a promise kept across 40 years of ruin is the most stubborn, most beautiful thing a human being can do. And that her father had been right about everything. "He'll come," David had written in the letter the lawyer carried up the stairs. "Maybe not right away. Life is hard, and men get lost. But he'll come, and he'll make it right, because that's who he is." He came. He made it right. He was exactly who her father said he was.